Stop calling. I'm with a client. Reed snapped into his phone while I stood less than 10 feet away in the Gold Coast Hotel lobby, watching his hand rest on Tatum Bell's lower back like it had learned the shape of her there. Her laugh came right after, bright and a little too loose for a room built around polished stone, smoked glass, and people who paid extra to keep their lives looking quiet. I did not step forward, because the room key sliding across the marble, the joint card in his hand, and the way neither of them glanced around had already finished the part that shock usually plays. I stayed near a tall arrangement of white orchids by the window and watched him sign with the same pen grip I had seen on tax returns, school forms, dinner checks, and every ordinary document of our married life. Tatum leaned in when the receptionist spoke, not tentative, not guilty, and Reed answered with that low, easy smile he used to save for me before he started spending it where I could not see it. That was the moment the lie stopped being a question, because nothing in his body looked improvised, and nothing in hers looked borrowed. I felt no urge to expose them, no trembling need to ask who she was, because I already knew both answers from the way his shoulders stayed loose and her suitcase stood beside his leg, like it belonged there. I had not come to this hotel to catch my husband betraying me. I had come because the paperwork was done. The timing was chosen, and I was finished letting him arrive first to every truth. When the elevator doors closed on both of them, I did not feel abandoned or loud inside, only clear enough to know that by nightfall, Reed would be holding the end of his marriage in his own hands. It had not broken in one clean moment I could point to later, because what came apart first was smaller and meaner than that, the kind of damage that learns patience before it learns nerve. On my 34th birthday, Reed left before sunrise for what he called an early breakfast with a distributor, and by 6 that evening, all I had was a text reading. Long day. We'll do dinner this weekend. I stood at our kitchen island with the screen still lit in my hand, looking at the untouched flowers Avery had sent that morning, and understood from that one message exactly how optional I had become. After that, the evidence stopped looking random once I let myself call it evidence, starting with the way his phone stayed face down through dinner and the new cologne that never smelled like home. Then came the client dinners that ran later than they used to, the polished explanations delivered too quickly, and the loyalty account activity that placed him in hotels, his official itineraries never named. I did not confront him after each discrepancy, because every clean lie arrived attached to something real. A receipt, a timestamp, a booking confirmation, and that made silence more useful than outrage. The first charge that stayed with me was a boutique hotel in River North that was nowhere on the event block for a regional sales conference. Reed had breezed through describing over coffee. 2 nights later, I found a dinner reimbursement filed for the same evening. Same city. Same stretch of hours he claimed had been all client conversation and no room for anything personal. I remember sitting at the dining table with our card statement open, one thumb pressed against the paper edge, and realizing I was no longer waiting for the marriage to explain itself. I brought the statements, travel confirmations, reimbursement summaries, and loyalty account history to Jocelyn Pierce in a quiet office above a bank branch where everything smelled faintly of paper and coffee. She read without interrupting, one hand flattening each page before moving to the next. And when she finally looked up, she did not ask whether I was sure. She tapped the River North charge, the duplicate travel nights, the matching dinner reimbursement, then the reporting chart with Tatum Bell's name under Reed's region, and said, "This is enough to stop guessing." From there, the blur turned into sequence, because every item that had been bothering me alone now sat beside another item that explained why it had mattered. The late dinners lined up with hotel activity, the hotel activity lined up with the expense filings, and the expense filings lined up with the same weeks Reed came home polished, distracted, and falsely patient. I had not hacked anything, followed anyone, or touched anything that was not mine to see. and the cleanest part of the whole file was how ordinary the evidence looked. Jocelyn built the map in neat categories while I sat across from her, with my hands folded around a legal pad I had barely written on since college. Shared card statements. Travel discrepancies. Reimbursement timing. Publicly visible event photos. And the company directory went into separate stacks until Reed's private story started looking like a business record. When Jocelyn circled Tatum's role and the repeated overlap between her schedule and his, I felt the last fog lift off the room. She explained the next steps in the same even tone she used to label each exhibit. File first. Preserve records. Document spending. And do nothing dramatic that could be turned back on me later. I nodded, because the proof had already changed the hardest part, which was not deciding whether my marriage was over, but deciding I no longer needed him to admit it first. By the time I left her office with copies clipped into a slim gray folder, I was no longer carrying suspicion from room to room, only a timeline with Reed's name on it and nowhere left for him to hide. I stayed in the lobby until the elevator carried Reed and Tatum out of sight, then crossed the room without hurry, my heels quiet against stone that had already seen worse secrets than mine. Near the valet bar, a private process server in a dark suit stood from his chair when he recognized me, and I passed him a look that meant nothing had changed. He gave one small nod, checked the time, and said, "When he comes down alone, I'll handle it cleanly," which was exactly why I had hired someone who did not need the moment to feel dramatic. Then I walked back to the front desk with the envelope I had brought from home, the one holding my wedding ring, the spare key, and a letter folded once. The receptionist looked up as I set it on the marble and kept my voice level enough for both of us when I said, "This one is personal, and it stays sealed." She glanced at my hand, then the envelope, then my face, and after a beat that carried more understanding than curiosity, she slid it beneath the desk and answered, "I understand." I did not ask what room they were in, and I did not need confirmation, because I had already watched the key cards change hands and seen Tatum's suitcase roll toward the elevator beside Reed's shoulder. That was enough to keep the scene honest, and honesty was the only thing I had any use for now. Stripped down to objects, timing, and signatures. Inside the letter, I had written only what the evidence had earned, not what anger might have enjoyed. And the sharpest line on the page was, "You were not caught. You were finished." When I turned toward the doors, the bartender was polishing stemware. A couple in linen was checking in, and somewhere behind me the low hotel music kept smoothing over other people's evenings. Nothing in the room rose to meet my marriage ending, and that suited me, because I had not come there to perform pain for strangers. By the time I stepped out onto the avenue and felt the late light hit my face, Reed still thought he was inside a private arrangement, and I already knew he was walking toward a file with his name all through it. By the time Reed came through the front door, I had been sitting at the kitchen table long enough for the tea beside my hand to go cold and stay untouched. He stopped the second he saw the envelope already opened beside me, then looked at my bare ring finger and exhaled. "Marin, what the hell is this supposed to be?" I kept my hands flat on the table and let him hear the answer without any help from my tone when I said, "It is exactly what you were handed." He crossed the kitchen too fast, still carrying the panic he had brought home from the hotel, and tried to force confusion over facts already printed on paper. "You had someone serve me at a hotel," he pushed out, then laughed once without humor. And I answered, "Privately, cleanly, and later than you deserved." He stared at me, waiting for a crack. So I gave him the room key, the shared card, the River North charges, and Tatum Bell's name in the same steady order. That was when the performance changed. Because once the hotel stopped being deniable, he reached for the smaller lie and said, "It was one mistake, and you are blowing this up." I looked at him across the same counter where I had once set out donor lists and dinner menus, then said, "No, Reed, One mistake does not learn a woman's travel rhythm, her hotel habits, and her work calendar. He flinched at that, not because it was cruel, but because the sentence left him nowhere to stand except inside the pattern he had built himself. His eyes moved toward the hallway, then back to me. And when he noticed the half-empty closet beyond the bedroom door, his voice dropped into something smaller. "You packed before today," he said, and I let that sit between us for a beat before answering. "I left before you checked in. You just did not know it yet." He tried once more to call it humiliation, and I stood, picked up my bag, and gave him the only truth he had not prepared for. "I did not embarrass you. Reed. I stopped covering for you." The next morning, Jocelyn moved faster than panic ever could, which mattered because panic burns hot and useless, while records stay sharp once someone puts dates beside them. We filed first, preserved what needed preserving, and turned every hotel charge, dinner reimbursement, and travel overlap into a clean timeline that did not need emotion to explain itself. By noon, the statements Reed had treated like harmless background detail were clipped into order, tagged by date, and carrying enough weight to outlast anything he might say later. I separated what I was allowed to separate, opened an individual account, redirected my paycheck, and locked down the cards tied only to my personal spending and routine. Then I copied every tax return, downloaded every shared statement, and photographed the house room by room so nothing valuable could later become vague or conveniently forgotten. I took only what belonged to me, left the rest untouched, and felt the difference immediately, because restraint is colder and more frightening than damage. That afternoon, Avery Knox sat across from me with my phone face down between us, listening while I laid out the hotel, the papers, the kitchen, and Reed's last thin excuses. When I finished, she folded her hands and said, "If you want this to hold, do not turn evidence into content." And I nodded before she even reached the end. She was right, because every fact I had worked better in a file than it ever would in a post written late. Angry, and easy to twist. That was the day money stopped feeling like atmosphere and started looking like structure. Visible, numbered, and impossible to romanticize once every charge had been lined up. Reed called, then called again, then left a voicemail asking whether I had been telling people my version, and I let the message sit unheard. The story no longer depended on how I sounded when I was hurt, because it already lived in filings, statements, preserved records, and the timing of everything he spent. The next morning, Jocelyn sent the packet to Nolan Briggs in Employee Relations, not as a wife's grievance, but as a clean record of reporting lines, expense timing, and travel overlap. It included the River North charges, the dinner reimbursements, Tatum Bell's role under Reed's regional structure, and the dates that placed private nights inside company-shaped schedules. I was not accusing anyone in public or asking for spectacle, only putting documents in front of the one person whose job was to care when policy and money started touching each other. By mid-morning, Nolan had me in a quiet conference room with a glass wall facing the lake, his tie still straight, his legal pad already marked with Reed's name. He asked careful questions in an even voice. Where did the records come from? What was shared property? What had I personally observed? And I answered without wandering. When I finished, he closed the folder once, looked at the reporting chart again, and said, "This is enough for us to open review today," which was all I had come to hear. I was there only briefly after that, long enough to confirm the timeline and leave before the room turned into something that looked personal instead of procedural. Nolan pulled Reed and Tatum out of the sales summit separately, froze the conversation inside company walls, and started asking the kind of questions polished people hate, because every answer narrows the next one. Reed had always relied on tone, on sounding reasonable a half-second before the facts caught up, but reimbursement lines, hotel dates, and reporting structures do not get embarrassed for him. Later, I learned just enough to understand the shape of it. Reed trying to call the travel client facing. Tatum keeping her voice measured. Nolan returning them both to the same printed record. No one had to raise a hand or voice, because the force of it came from ordinary details that had already been entered, approved, expensed, and saved in systems neither of them controlled. By the time I stepped back onto the sidewalk, the work part of Reed's life was no longer a place he could use to hide from me, because it had become the place where hiding stopped working. Avery warned me the social part would move faster than the legal part. Not because people love truth, but because they can smell strain the minute polished routines stop holding. Within 2 days, Reed had started telling select people I was overreacting, that I had shown up at his work emotional and confused, which would have sounded plausible if records had not already reached Nolan first. I did not chase each version down, because once a man starts softening facts before anyone asks for them, he usually tells on himself more clearly than his enemies ever could. That week, I attended a donor preview at the museum in a black dress I had worn before, the kind of choice that kept the room from thinking I had come to announce anything. I moved through the evening exactly as I always had, greeting trustees, thanking sponsors, accepting air kisses, until one older woman I trusted touched my forearm lightly and asked, "Are you all right?" "Sweetheart." I held her gaze and gave her the only sentence Avery and I had agreed was worth repeating. The marriage ended after clear evidence of an inappropriate relationship and misuse of shared and work-related funds. That was enough. Because in rooms like that, one clean sentence lands harder than a speech, especially when it names money, conduct, and proof without sounding eager to punish. No one pressed me after that, yet the temperature around Reed changed anyway. And by the end of the week, people were no longer describing Tatum as sharp or promising. They were describing her carefully, which is what happens when a woman mistakes access for a rival and then discovers everyone in the room understands the difference without saying it out loud. By the time mediation opened, the internal review had already done what anger never could, which was reduce Reed's charm to expense lines, approvals, and dates with his name attached. He arrived looking thinner and more careful, while Jocelyn set down a clean binder holding the hotel nights, overlapping reimbursements, and shared funds used during the affair without once needing my hurt to explain any of it. Tatum stayed in place just long enough to become a problem. No manager wanted attached to their team. And then the upward path she had worn so confidently disappeared underneath her. Once the numbers were laid out in sequence, Reed tried the same strategy he had used at home, separating the marriage from the money as if betrayal became smaller once the receipts were called technical. Jocelyn turned one page, tapped the highlighted totals, and answered, "No, Mr. Sutton. Your records did that before she ever had to file." And the room went still in the clean, hard way it does when facts stop leaving exits. I watched him look down at the same dates I had once stared at alone in my kitchen and saw that he finally understood the problem was no longer what he could explain, but what had already been preserved. After that, the settlement moved with the cold efficiency of people who know exactly how much a longer fight would cost and exactly who would lose most by continuing it. Reed gave up more than he had expected because every extra argument meant reliving spending, travel, and timing already organized against him. And for the first time, he seemed tired of hearing his own version. When he finally looked up and said, almost under his breath, "I never thought it would cost this much," I knew he was not talking only about money. Avery kept the social perimeter quiet. Nolan kept the work consequences factual. And Tatum learned too late that proximity to a life is not the same thing as securing it. I signed the last page with a steadier hand than I had brought into any room that year, and no one asked for one more conversation after that. Everybody walked out carrying exactly what belonged to them. A few months later, I was living in a smaller condo near the lake, where the mornings were brighter, the closets were quieter, and nothing in the room belonged to a lie. I went back to the museum without carrying anybody else's image on my shoulders. And the first full week I worked, I slept through every night. Some mornings I still reached for a second cup before remembering there was only me now. And that small correction felt cleaner than anything Reed ever called love. What surprised me was not that peace came back, but that it arrived with structure, with my name on the lease, my paycheck landing cleanly, my life answering to me. I did not win because Reed lost. I won because when the noise ended, I was still standing there with my work, my voice, and my future. If this story stayed with you, thank you for listening. And if you are rebuilding too, I hope you find the kind of love that feels honest.